All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our discussion of Chapter 10, which deals with arguments of evaluation. In Chapter 8, we discussed arguments of fact, which goes over those core issues of whether something happened or did not happen, the nature of certain incidents. In Chapter 9, we discussed arguments of definition, which shows us the scope of a lot of our modern issues come down to how we define them. So, issues such as women's reproductive rights, consent. All of these issues have legal definitions, but also have operational or definitions by example to help us flesh out exactly what is the issue that we are addressing. Now, today we move on with the next part of our stasis argument, which deals with arguments of evaluation. So, once again, we are surrounded by evaluations every single day of our life. So, some questions before we delve into this chapter is who do you consider to be the worst American generation? Or what is the most overrated food or meal? Or who has been the best United States of America president? Now, immediately, you probably have a couple of ideas that sprout to your head. And what's interesting about this is that you have already made an evaluation. Within deciding who was the best, you obviously omitted certain individuals, certain foods, certain generations, and you did so by trying to establish what was most meaningful for you in order to determine what was the best of something or the worst of something or the most overrated of something. And so we start to realize that we are constantly making these evaluations in our everyday life, from determining whether or not we're going to go to a certain place to eat or our college majors. We're constantly making evaluations. In 2020, during the presidential election, the American public made an evaluation between President Donald Trump and President elect Joe Biden. Also, in the summer of 2020, there were debates in regards to who was the greatest basketball player of all time, Michael Jordan or LeBron James. Now, depending upon what you viewed as the most important, depending upon your criteria of establishing the best choice of president in regards to foreign policy, in regards to domestic policy, in regards to the economy or immigration, all of these issues established a criteria that you were able to create to determine who was the best. In the debate between LeBron James and Michael Jordan, you have individuals who use the criteria of championship rings or championship MVPs. We have other individuals who talk about the impact of the game worldwide, or even in some cases, you're addressing points and rebounds, etc. So, in some cases, we use statistics. In some other cases, we talk about the overall feel that a person has given you. I remember in my past, I would have this debate in my family about who was the greatest, Michael Jackson or Prince. That was a debate in the 1980s and early 90s of who was the best pop star at that time. They were both incredible, so do not put me on the spot right now. But also, when I moved to the South about 10 years ago, my partner was a fanatic of In-N-Out, and then we found this place called Whataburger, and we found other regional places to eat as the best hamburger. So now we have debates on what is the best regional hamburger. And so there's a very online, you start to see like really anger come about determining what is the best hamburger. But the reason why we start to have this anger is because we realize that evaluations are part of our everyday life. That these are the everyday arguments that we are consistently making. And what's interesting about these arguments is that we apply criteria to a particular problem, and then we make a decision based upon that. So every decision that we make, we are establishing this criteria to help us make that decision. So from elections to what to wear, to where to eat, political opinion shows, award shows, sports debates, competitive reality TV shows, we realize that our pop culture is built on debate and evaluations. Even the news is an evaluation and a debate. And so I think it's really important to really discuss how do we determine what is the best or better or good in relationship to other things. And arguments of evaluation allows us to establish that. And the reason why arguments of evaluation are incredibly impactful and effective. And the most effective evaluations are ones that establish a criteria for making a choice. And so evaluations always involve standards. And so there's a criteria of evaluations. And so these standards are the things that we use to establish for judging anything. And so when we're trying to determine what is the best thing to wear today, most likely we're going to look at the weather. We're going to look at what we wore yesterday. We're going to look at the occasion. We're going to look at a lot of different options and criteria to help us establish what to wear. But we also realize that criteria gets a little bit complicated when a subject is a bit more abstract. So, if I were to ask you what would make the best foreign policy for an American president in the 21st century, most likely many of you would have different answers of what makes good foreign policy. Would it be in terms of more interactionism, where we interact with the global community a little bit more? Is it more isolationism, where the United States becomes more of an isolated nation? So, just in regards to those two paradigms, that's a criteria. But if you were to even get into more in terms of financial aid, in regards to military support, in regards to helping other economies, you start to realize that the criteria of establishing good foreign policy is incredibly complicated. And even decisions such as college majors. I'm not sure how many of you have changed your major, but I did a couple of times when I was in college. And so, because of that, we start to realize that we start to have different criteria depending on who we were at the age of 16 or 17 to who we are now as individuals. So, some of that and the things that we used to find important probably aren't as important now. So, we start to realize that our criteria has shifted, or even trying to think of your favorite song. My child nowadays asks me every day, what's my favorite song or my favorite color? And it's a very difficult thing to ask because, one, I'm a music snob, but number two, different music involves different emotions. Some things I'm going to love one day more than another, in regards to the sound and in regards to the aesthetic, in regards to the feeling that it gives me. And so we start to realize that even determining what is your favorite song gets a little bit complicated. And one of the really interesting things about criteria is that it shifts over time. What Americans view as the most important issues will shift every 4 years or so, depending upon what has gone on in our nation's current history. We saw this within 2001, after 9/11, that America was mostly into securing the American public. They were into making sure that America was protected. So we saw the establishments of programs such as Homeland Security started to get a little bit more governmental support and population support in regards to it. But we now see that that's not so much of an issue anymore. We start to see issues now regarding immigration and economy, and now virus with COVID and disease. And so we start to see how our criteria of determining whether or not something is important also begins to shift. And so, one of the key things to note is that we should be suspicious of our judgments, especially when we make them casually. In our textbook, it mentions this really interesting case of news reporting of how it takes 45 African people to be noted just for one European who was murdered in a crime or in a terrorist attack. In regards to terrorism across the globe, we don't necessarily spend a lot of time talking about terrorism in places in the African continent or in Asia, but we are really tuned in to these acts of terrorism within the United States and other Western countries. And one of the reasons behind that is that our evaluations are selective, that we think that certain populations matter more than others. Now, granted, not all of us think that way, and I'm not applying that wide scale, but we start to see it in terms of what we are attracted to or what we pay attention to is also a form of evaluation. And so we start to even see this within the Black Lives Matters protests within 2020 and dating back to 2016, where many African Americans and people of color were already in tune to some of these issues, while many white Americans were not. And because of that, we start to see that the criteria between these two groups were often incompatible in regards to what they wanted out of society. Or out of this particular issue, or if they were even aware of it. And so we start to see how evaluations really play a role in terms of not just like how we determine whether something is good or bad or in comparison to another thing, but also in terms of our own attention, what we are going to prioritize over something else. Now, in regards to criteria of evaluations, serious evaluations always require reflection. So we're always asking the question of why. And so we're always trying to push an argument of evaluation hard enough that even simple judgments become challenging and intriguing. So in understanding that our evaluations and sometimes are maybe colored by our immediate experiences, we always have to engage with ourselves in determining, is this criteria something about that we have established just for this occasion, or is this criteria that we are going to establish across the board? And so criteria of evaluation isn't static. They differ according to time and to the audience. So I might have a different criteria of something compared to you. An example of this could be seen in if any of you have had to choose an apartment to live in or chose a home. Most likely, you had to make a couple of decisions on what you prioritize in terms of location and in regards to amenities, in regards to rooms, in regards to space. And depending upon your criteria of what you found most important, you're going to select that house compared to someone else who might just really go for location and not necessarily in terms of the square footage of a house. Or even going to a restaurant, or even your most favorite films. These are all individual criteria that impact how you are going to evaluate something. Now, whenever we are trying to characterize evaluations, we realize that there is certain evidence that we need. So once we've established our criteria of these are the things that I feel are the most important to discuss this issue or to come to an evaluation, we realize we need evidence in order to support it. And so hard evidence are things such as like facts, statistics, testimony, the types of evidence that we discussed in chapter 4. And so these types of hard evidence is called quantitative arguments. And so these rely on criteria that can be measured, counted, or demonstrated in some mechanical fashion. So something is taller than something else, or something is faster. So if I were to buy a car and I'm looking for a car that, has a little pep to it, I'm going to determine whether or not this car can, acceleration is better than the other car. We also determine whether or not something is smoother than something else. For those that eat peanut butter or jelly or any other food snobs, you start to realize that texture is important, or we are quieter or even more powerful than something else. Now, in addition to quantitative arguments, we also realize that we can use constructed evidence also, that not every decision we make is based upon measurements, that there are certain elements that we also have to take into consideration, and these are the human elements of it. And so this is shaped by language and various kinds of logic. And so these qualitative arguments rely on criteria that must be explained through language and media. And we rely on matters such as values, traditions, and emotions. So for most of us, or many of you, we have families, and so in that regard, a lot of the things that we find beneficial or good is through that lens of our family dynamic. But in addition to breaking away from family dynamics and traditions, we also have things such as emotions. So these things take into account ethical considerations, beneficial considerations, whether or not something is more handsome or noble than something else. If you've ever gone out on a date before, there was probably a list of criteria that you had that wasn't hard evidence. It was probably something in regards to looks, or if that person has a good smile, or were they funny. And these are things that we can't actually measure. I mean, there are some measurements of that, but we don't necessarily go by the traditional measurements. There's just something innate within our emotions that tells us what we should go for. And so a good smile for one person might not necessarily be good for another person, depending upon that particular smile. But we start to see that these qualitative arguments also, our qualitative evidence also take a key role in determining what we consider to be important. So when we are developing an evaluative argument, we realize that evaluative arguments are best when you are trying to claim the value of one item or one item over another. And so there is a format that we utilize that looks very similar to the formats that we have been discussing since chapter 7. And so the format of an evaluative argument looks like this. You first begin with your claim, which is a declarative statement. You then move on to your reason, which are your implications. So these are the reasons why I feel that this argument is important, or I feel why this evidence is necessary. You then establish your criteria. So in determining whether or not this is good or bad, these are the things that we are going to measure, or are the things that we are going to consider to determine this issue. And then you would utilize your evidence to back up that declarative claim and your reason. And so you'll utilize either qualitative or quantitative evidence. And so when you are formulating your criteria, the first thing that we do is sometimes we figure out what is the thing that we don't like. And so, what sucks about this? And then you start to determine why. You ask the question, all right, why do I think this is not sufficient in regards to this issue? And so then you begin to defend your position. And when you begin to defend your position, that's when your criteria is usually developed. So once you start to get the reasons why this thing is not beneficial or this thing is not better than something else, that's when you usually start to develop the criteria. In many cases, we think that we develop criteria by, oh, I think this thing is great, so here's a list of criteria. But that's not true. I think that it's best to start off with what are the things that you don't think are beneficial in determining this criteria, and then begin to eliminate those. And so you start by listing the possible standards, and then you pare them down to the bare essentials. And so we utilize a lot of value terms when we begin to pare things down to the essentials. And so we use a lot of these terms such as tremendous, or great, or amazing, or poor. And if you were to ask a person, well, what does great mean or amazing means? Those definitions of those terms begin to shift depending upon the issue. And so we realize that we need to establish a criteria and evaluation for these terms. So what exactly do you mean by tremendous? What does good mean or poor mean in regard to this particular issue? And the reason why we do this is because we need to identify a fundamental quality. Throughout chapter 9's discussion, we talked about how in definitions, we sometimes create definitions just to win an argument. And in many cases, we do the same thing with evaluations, where we develop these criteria just to win that specific argument. And if that's the case, then it's not a real criteria. These are just things that we're doing. These are verbal flexes that we have in order to win certain discussions, but these aren't actual arguments that we are making. And so your standards should make sense on their own merits and apply across the board. They should not just be for this one particular item or this one particular issue or situation within that issue in order to make that claim. And so when you're making your claim, claims can be stated directly or more rarely strongly implied. So it's an essential, this is the best option in regards to foreign policy, or blah, blah, blah is the best president in the United States of American history. These are strong claims that you're making in which your rationale, your criteria, and your evidence flows through. And so writers realize that strong statements followed by reasonable qualifiers work the best. So don't pretend that your object is something that it's not. In-N-Out is not gourmet food, but it is something else. What is it? What makes it different than other fast food places? And that's when you begin to develop your criteria of what makes it the best fast food place in regards to that. So some might say fresh ingredients, some might say freshly made, some might say the quality of the beef. And so then from there you start to see this criteria become developed. And so when you are presenting your evidence, you need to realize that the more evidence in an evaluation, the better. So realizing that not just utilizing quantitative measurements, but also qualitative measurements is key. But you also have to decide how much detail your readers want for an argument. In some cases, especially in technical subjects, you might make your basic case brief. So if I were to discuss the best car to buy, and you're not really a person that really understands cars that well, I would probably pick a few criteria and then leave it there, as this is the most important criteria in purchasing a car, and these are the things to look for, and then you do your comparison and contrasting to pays based on that. I wouldn't necessarily go into all of the technical elements of a car in determining what is the best car if you're not really interested in that. Now, not all pieces of evidence are equally convincing. And so, therefore, they shouldn't be treated as such. I think that one of the key things that we do in arguments is that every argument that we make is the most important argument at that time. Every piece of evidence is the smoking gun that's going to win us the arguments. Arguments of evaluations don't work that way. And so, therefore, if it's not as strong of an argument or a weaker argument, it's okay because you're building up to a larger case. And so your job is to select evidence that is most likely to influence your readers. And so you arrange the argument to build towards your best material. And that's a really cool thing about arguments of evaluation, that in some other cases we try to win the argument within the very first couple of minutes. But within these arguments, we realize that we're trying to change the perspective of whether something is good or bad. And that takes a lot of work. And so therefore, you need to make sure that you're building towards a large argument or a more substantial argument. And so the best material will be evidence that's specific, detailed, memorable, and derived from credible sources. So always make sure that you are picking the best material that connects to your audience. And so when we talk about this evidence and we talk about these evaluations, I think it's really important to also address, do we have any qualitative biases or quantitative biases? And also in regards to these subjects or these terms, are there certain evidence that we just think is the best without actually really looking into whether or not that's the best criteria to establish something, or if this is the best evidence to use in regards to this case? So as we start to develop these arguments, I want you to consider these biases that you might have in regards to criteria or even the evidence that you use as a stopping point. Where it's like, if you realize that there's bias present, make sure to reevaluate the evidence that you're using to make that effective argument. But as we see, these arguments of evaluations are incredibly important, and they're plentiful in terms of our society. Most likely today, you will make 5 different arguments of evaluations. So start to think about the criteria you use and how impactful it is to make your decision. All right, everyone. Thank you all so very much. I will see you again for our Chapter 11 discussion.